So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Danaya Zaria. I'm a lecturer in international law at the Faculty of Laws at UCL. It is with particular pleasure that I'm hosting today's UCL Lunch Hour Lecture by Professor Grubb, who is a professor of international energy and climate change policy at UCL at the Institute of Sustainable Resources. He's also the editor-in-chief of Climate Policy and is a chair of the UK panel of technical experts on energy market reform. His lecture is entitled Planetary Economics, Getting to a Stable Climate with a Healthy Economy, which for me, this is a very timely topic of importance and interest worldwide. I will give the floor to Professor Grubb for approximately 35 minutes. And then I will open the floor to questions from the audience. For those of you who would like to tweet about the event's Twitter feed is at UCL LHL. You can find it at the PowerPoint behind us. And those of you who would like to ask questions through Slido, the event's code is 5021. Again, the code is behind us. So without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Grubb.
Thank you very much. I'd actually like to start, perhaps by dating myself and asking how many of you know, in outline, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Good. Well, in that case, you know the answer, ultimate, is 42. And I'm going to start by saying the answer to this lecture on climate change and one of the great challenges of the 21st century is 3. I hope by the end of the lecture, you will see what I mean and what kind of question and questions I have associated with that answer. And I'm going to start, and I've pitched this at a pretty broad conceptual level about the role of economic thinking in either succeeding or failing in helping us to get to grips with climate change. So I'm going to start with a very straightforward question in one way: what is economics? And there's been a long-standing debate about the extent to which economics is a science, which economists like to claim, or is it an art? So, being old-fashioned, I first turned to the Oxford English Dictionary and discovered, no question, economics is the science of political economy. You therefore need to know what is political economy, and the answer is it's the art of managing the resources of people and its government. Now, when we're dealing with climate change and its economics, we're therefore dealing with science and art of a problem in which the people are basically everyone on the planet today and future generations. The resources concern the planet, its atmosphere, its oceans, and the climatic patterns, and there is no global government to solve that problem for us. So it's a very unusual problem in terms of its sheer scale and scope, and that's the challenge that I really want to explore in this talk. I'm not going to dwell on the science. I'm not even going to address what exactly is a stable climate, but I think it's pretty clear that we don't have one, and we are heading pretty rapidly in the opposite direction. What you see on the left here is a sort of classic graph of global temperature trends, along with all the oscillations and the uncertainties going back, and on the right a rather neat graphic someone pitched to me this morning about how temperature has evolved over the last 100 and so years. And you see it's moving towards the boundaries which have been suggested by science and written into the Paris Agreement just over a year ago, that we should stay within 2 degrees and try and keep as close to 1.5 as possible, and we're already getting close to that limit. Can we solve a problem on this scale? Well, there's been an awful lot written. It remains fundamentally a problem of big picture risk management with deep uncertainty. Not so much about the fundamental science. At a simple level, it's actually pretty straightforward, but actually what are the consequences of accumulating greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, changing radiative balance, changing et cetera, et cetera. And even worse, from an economic perspective, how do you value them? How do you act? How do you coordinate responses, et cetera? And in recent years, it's gained a number of aphorisms about it. Nick Stern, perhaps the most famous economist in the area, called it the biggest market failure in history because it imposes damage which aren't costed into the market. It's also been called the perfect moral storm because it involves deeply ethical questions about our responsibilities to others in other countries, future generations, etc. And social scientists have called it a super wicked problem. Wicked one is bad enough, super wicked is fantastically complicated for a political system to solve. And it has to be said, we've not been doing very well globally. I hate to admit I've been in this area ever since the first report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the UN framework that followed in '92. So for a quarter of a century, we've been bashing our heads against this, but global emissions keep on rising. And probably still are, although we could go into some other interesting changes in the last year or two. And a few years ago, around the time I'd sat down and I'd left my previous job at the UK Carbon Trust to try and pull together, why is this so hard? Why are we struggling so hard? I was asked to give a lecture in Paris by Laurence Toubiana, who became the French ambassador and special envoy for the Paris Climate Conference, a central figure in that. Rather foolishly, I accepted her invitation, and then I asked what was the question. And she said, well, I want you to talk about whether economics has helped or hindered our getting to grips with this problem. Now, I was in the economics faculty in Cambridge University, and I was chief economist at the Carbon Trust, so it's kind of a provocative question. But it was also a very interesting one, and it helped to shape the inquiry in the resulting book. As a prelude to this, I want to just outline and keep it sort of in the back of your minds as we go through the rest. The fact that there is no single uniform view of cost, benefits, and risks. If we take, if you like, a classical economic construction, what you want to do is try and establish what are the damages that could be imposed, where are the tangible impacts that can be attributed to climate change, and you weigh up the costs and benefits, and that should lead you to estimate a social cost of carbon emissions, the damage inflicted by emitting a ton of CO2, and you should then put that as a price added on basically all fossil fuel activities. And then the market should solve the problem. You have solved what Nick Stern called the greatest market failure in history by putting the price on it. That's not, however, the only way of approaching it. If we're honest, most people, most of the time, in most of the world, are probably closer to being indifferent, don't know, or disempowered. Well, I can't really do anything about it anyway. It's too big. It's beyond my reach. And frankly, the best psychological approach in that circumstance is usually the old phrase, ignorance is bliss. And try and believe that there's not a problem to be solved because you can't solve it anyway. And that's broadly where we've been for the first few decades of climate change. We are now quite clearly moving beyond that in terms of at least the observed impact and imposed costs. And there is then at the other end of the spectrum a third level, if you like, of risk conception, which says, well, I can't evaluate exactly the tangible costs and add them all up in a nice economic calculation, but frankly, this is going to disrupt human society, has the potential to. We want to be secure, we want our food to be secure. In effect, it's more analogous to keeping the country safe. It's what the CIA calls climate is a threat multiplier. We have enough problems in the world without climate instability added on. And what you want to do is to contain the problem, defend the problem, mitigate emissions enough to be sufficiently safe and adapt to the rest. Now, if unchecked, ultimately we all end up with security threatened by climate change. The most vulnerable regions arguably already are. And indeed, there is some significant empirical evidence that the Syrian war has a substantial degree of climate change as a factor behind the collapse of that society. I'm actually not going to really say much more about the impacts because I'm primarily an energy economist looking at how do we solve the problem at root. in terms of the drivers of emissions. And therefore, I'll try and construct an outline in a sort of just an initial framing of the energy CO2 challenge, saying, well, clearly we want to try and decarbonize the global economy, decarbonize energy mix, carbon per unit of energy, and we want to enhance global energy efficiency. We want to get more bang for the buck of what we consume. And the chart here is showing, with the black line in the top left, on those two axes, the progress that we made from 1980 to 1990, which was the decade after two really quite dramatic oil shocks shook the global economy and the global energy system. And you can see we did significantly improve global energy efficiency, economic output per unit energy. We made a little bit of progress in decarbonisation, but then that quickly ran out and we've remained pretty flat since. And in the subsequent two decades to 2010, we actually slowed down even the efficiency and didn't do much, if anything, in the way of global decarbonisation. Now, the real story, fortunately, is much more complex and interesting, but it's a useful context. Because one thing is we have to focus on the dynamics of how we change these huge systems. So what the rest of the chart shows is, well, a typical proxy is if we are going to get remotely close to the goals set out that science says is needed, we need to halve global emissions by mid-century, and that is the outer red dotted line there. And it can be any sort of combination of decarbonising the energy mix and improving energy efficiency, except that actually if you look at the upper black dotted line, you have a quite inconceivable rate whereby you would have to improve global energy efficiency, given where we got in the last 30 years. And if you take the other extreme, you basically have to turn a complete right angle and suddenly decarbonise in a very radical way. And I know very few economists who think either of those is actually feasible. What most of the scenarios suggest might be feasible is a strong mix of both. You reduce the scale of the problem for efficiency and you roll out low carbon energy sources as quickly as you can. The historical average rate of efficiency has been about 1.3%. These kind of scenarios suggest we already need to get global emissions down 20% from 1990 levels. We've gone up since then, within what is now just a 13-year period, which is pretty dramatic and challenging. The central point here is this is not just a bit of deviation from business as usual. It's not a little bit of acceleration and a little bit of change. This is a radical transformation that would be required. Now, if you put yourself in the mindset of a radical transformation, you need to think more deeply about what can and cannot economics sensibly contribute. So a way of framing the classical economic view on this is to say, well, we have certain resources vertically here. We use those resources to generate economic welfare, output, consumption, whatever you want to call it. And there's this kind of, actually most textbooks just put it as a straight line. I've kind of broadened it and curved it a bit for various reasons. But it's effectively a technology frontier which says, how can we get the most out of the resources we have? And the assumption is that that's where we want to be. That's where any decently designed market will be. It will get the best you can. And what actually makes economics interesting, because viewed like that, it's really boring. What makes it interesting, of course, is there's hundreds of thousands of millions of different inputs to an economy. And actually getting the best mix out of them is impossibly complex for any central planner, which is why markets tend to deliver the best allocation of resources, given certain assumptions, and including getting the prices right. And so economists tend to say, well, the best approach is to put a price on carbon to reflect the damages. And yes, technology is important. It'd be nice if that curve moved, so we need some research and development if we can show that the market is not providing adequate innovation. By the way, the kind of estimates that have come out for the social cost of carbon, a measure of the damages, actually fantastically uncertain. But despite a quarter of a century of research and debate, Nevertheless, the mean of almost all the estimates are above $30 to $40 or euros, doesn't matter much, ton of CO2, which is much bigger than the carbon price that has actually been established in almost any jurisdiction except for Scandinavia and a couple of others. So we kind of have a problem: inadequate carbon pricing, uncertainty about various other elements. And what I want to suggest is that was the kind of effectively the scientific expression of an art founded on the assumption that what we're dealing with, optimizing behavior based on relative prices, representative agents, i.e. we're all the same basically, we all do exactly the same behavior and maximize output with respect to inputs. We have rational expectations, stable preferences, stable technology trends, etc. Given those assumptions, we have an enormous body of well-established economic theory, typically known as neoclassical and welfare economics. Great. But that's not the only kind of behavior out there. Just as I said, it's not the only kind of way of approaching the risks and damages. Another way is, or another area of behavior, decision processes, is what has been known, slightly ugly term, of satisficing behavior, which is actually, typified by habits where you kind of do things the way that you're used to doing them. You may be quite averse to changing that because you don't really know or can't be bothered. You may be wary of new investment. Typically, there's quite a lot of myopia. You don't think or look very far ahead. You don't pay much attention to incidental, intangible costs. I mean, let's face it, how many people in this room got up this morning and thought, do you know what, I'm going to optimize my energy use today? Great, we got one. In my academic career, I've seen a certain amount of sort of ideological warfare between these different camps. Who's really right? How do people really behave? Is neoclassical theory actually good enough, etc.? And my view on that is it's the wrong question. The interesting thing is that actually what these describe are different processes that occur at different scales, different time scales. So when you look at energy efficiency, most of you would actually find you could save money that will pay back in a couple of years at least, which is actually a pretty good deal. So typically short time horizon, whereas markets tend to be looking maybe a couple of years up to a couple of decades ahead, not more when you look at financial markets certainly, and transformation processes can take decades, last a century. The social unit also changes. Small decision-making units like you and me, or a small unit in a firm, and the first domain here, right through to sort of market structures and large firm behavior, and at the bottom, actually the global scale of technology diffusion. So basically all of these theories are right, but they just describe different processes that go on different scales. So you have three different domains, different characteristics, different theoretical foundations. The significant thing is that whereas intrinsically that second domain involved trade-offs, you have to vary the mix of resources and reflect the damage, this first domain offers a clear potential for improved efficiency and improved services delivered, I nearly said simply, but not simply, but by changing those underlying behavioural and structural characteristics. Whilst the third domain offers you the potential for not just bits of incremental innovation, but whole new technology waves, which we know from economic history have actually been the foundation of economic growth spurts as well. So it makes life much more interesting. Now, you could say the art, therefore, is simply recognizing that reality is much more complicated than any single theory. And, hey, you could actually also argue that's fundamental to the science. It's not mathematical science, but it's actually observational reality. If we now turn to the question, well, okay, if we recognize that, how do we sort of apply the science to the arts, i.e., what can we deduce on these different domains? Well, I've written a kind of 500-page book on this, in which I've only really selected this one bit of data, which is around this third domain. What do we know about innovation processes, transformation processes? Well, let's at least start by looking some data. On the left, what you have is how much do different sectors spend on innovation. So IT, pharmaceuticals, which we think of as being the fount of innovation and new economic development, spend 10 to 15% of their turnover. on innovation. We are really after radical change in, let's see, construction, buildings and all that, cement, oil industry, metal, steel, incredibly energy intensive, etc. We're after radical innovation in some of the least innovative sectors in our societies. And the book develops a theory about why that is. There's astonishingly little theory being written about as intersectoral comparisons, but I think there's very clear explanations. In this lecture, I just wanted to flag the point that actually when you look at third domain economics, what really jumps out is, first, neither the pace of innovation nor its direction is self-optimizing. A market will not deliver optimal innovation, full stop. Therefore, and given the role of innovation in economic growth, accelerating such innovation can generate an economic surplus, which potentially you can share between public and private sector. Some of you may know that Mariana Mazzucato, one of the world's experts on innovation, is joining UCL in March to set up an Institute of Innovation for Public Purpose, which is fundamentally good economic, in my view. Innovation is not synonymous with R&D. It does not just mean throwing a bit more money at universities. Sorry, folks. It's a very complex process that involves the whole development, demonstration, confidence building, supply chain development, commercialization, consumer buyer engagement, etc. The economic gains emerge as those industries get closer to the markets, at which point you're starting to also do something else important, which is to deter more carbon-intensive emitting stock, which is basically a sunk asset that will never realize its full economic value. There's a lot of worry about climate policies driving carbon leakage, i.e. dirty industries abroad. The flip side is actually developing new technologies which then diffuse and chase and ultimately overwhelm the high carbon industries is also intrinsic to a dynamic view based on these multiple domains, which then also amplifies the economic gains to those emergent industries and the gains to Pillar 1 policies, which are effectively, in this first domain, kind of have accelerating the adoption of better technologies and ways of doing things. And this has, and there's a whole chapter in the book called The Dark Matter of Economic Growth, because this links right into the heart of modern debates about economic growth and the role of structural efficiency improvements and the role of innovation in ways that cannot be explained under neoclassical theories. So there's an intimate link here with the macroeconomic debates. I don't have time to go into that, but I did want to flag an empirical point in this, which is just to show that this is not all concepts and not all stuff. A lot has been happening. I have to say it's been happening despite the advice of The Economist, which on renewable energy looked at solar tariffs, the German Energiewende, energy transformation, said this is absolutely ridiculous. What are the Germans thinking of? This is fantastically expensive way of reducing carbon, costs over $150 per ton saved. Just you should abandon all these technology-specific things and just get a general price on carbon. Well, ignoring that advice has actually led to a technological revolution with a truly dramatic fall in solar PV costs, as illustrated there, by more than a factor of 3, and more recently, a even more dramatic fall in the costs of battery, obviously driven partly by electric vehicles and the clean transport agenda, which means that, more than anything else, because solar is the world's biggest renewable resource, it's a vast energy resource, about 10,000 times as much sun reaches the planet as we actually consume at any given moment in time. So it's opened up the whole prospect of low carbon development at no higher costs. And that is a radical transformation. And to say, well, that was economically stupid, involves a very strange definition of economics. What it does imply is that we are not simply looking at a question of, well, we kind of have a normal future, and the question is how much more does it cost to cut emissions? What we're actually looking at, and I don't know if this graph captures it well, the future's coming towards you, and on the right-hand side you have a future in which we are investing and getting better at digging more carbon out of the ground and burning it in all sorts of new and imaginative ways. We've actually invested an awful lot over the last decade in basically messing up the atmosphere more cheaply. We have also, fortunately, been investing quite a lot on the left-hand side of this, which is the more green futures, which tend to be more highly innovative, increasingly integrated. For example, the role of electric cars interface with the electricity system, smart low-carbon electricity, biomass potentially in appropriate ways, tends to be more capital intensive, but then virtually free to run. All those are very different than the typical fossil fuel future. Again, this is not a higher cost version of a fossil fuel future, it's a radically different way of developing the energy system. And there is some evidence, well, first of all, I don't think we know which is more costly. It's going to depend on how these systems evolve. What is probably true is that getting stuck in the middle and messing around with a bit of both is more costly than either. But it's a structural choice about directions we're going. And that implies that policy doesn't need to just steer marginal change, but more structural, systemic change. It needs to use the different pillars of policy that are matched to the different domains. And there are potentially some quite big economic and financial benefits from just creating contractual certainty in this. I actually put at the top a quote from Seneca, close to 3,000 years ago, I should think. If you don't have a clue where you're going, then no wind is likely to be helpful. And direction is important. Now I'm going to start wrapping up this because first, just a compact way, I hope, and I've skipped sort of individual policy instruments, but you can kind of try and stitch things together in this kind of way. I showed you this frontier and the trade-offs. Actually, the first domain stuff is broadly around the fact that most real people and organizations, most of the time, are some way to the left of what is in principle possible with current technology. And therefore, helping to move them towards that frontier is beneficial all round. There are the terminologies that I introduce into the book with the sort of the name tag and the, if you like, the precision of arguing that there are three domains of processes, which the third domain is really at the heart of a transformation strategy, not just the innovation, but the evolution of complex systems. And therefore, where you want to be is one of the lower arrows, accelerating innovation, but in a low carbon direction with net economic gain. As I said, those processes operate, it's not a battle which of those is right. It is a question of what are the different scales at which these processes dominate. And here is the intellectual crux of the link with energy and climate, this is for a problem which spans the inattentive decision maker of every person on the planet, and at the same time, the long-term transformation of some of the most complex systems we've ever developed. Has to be said, so far, we've made more progress on energy efficiency, and I didn't show you the more recent data on that, and technology renewables, which I've indicated, rather than the classical prescription of carbon pricing. Now, if I try and wind this up into conclusions, first on the theory and then the practice, I come back to Laurence's question, has economics helped or hindered? My view is, well, it depends. It's been very helpful when it's understood and respected the boundaries of the theory and the assumptions upon which it's rests, and it's been very unhelpful when it's simply trampled across them and say, well, people in the world should behave in this kind of way, and therefore a carbon price is the only thing we need to do. Not rocket science, but frequently overlooked. I think maybe one reason it's overlooked, quite apart from the fact that people haven't sort of really articulated it in terms of these different domains, is actually to really get to grips with it, we are in the land of what I call interdisciplinary economics. You cannot understand first domain economics without recognizing the social and psychological foundations upon which both risk perceptions and behaviors ultimately rest. And you may note an alliance, coming back to my first slide about risk perception, which is even if people really don't know and don't care about climate change, they can still get motivated by saving money through improved efficiency, or by smarter electric cars, or by all sorts of other possibilities. The third domain is not a license to say, yeah, let the geeks solve this, they'll come up with something magic one day, because reality is constrained by the engineering and physical determinants of what you can and cannot do. And therefore, solar and wind are really crucial because they are the big renewable energy resources. And actually, we're doing pretty well in moving towards the technology, although not the cost frontiers of those technologies. So you can't hope that some magic bullet is going to fall like manna from heaven. You've got to get to grips and use the resources we have. And all of the above involves quite powerful regulatory and institutional dimensions. And I'm sometimes tempted to get drawn further because it must admit, I was originally trained in physics. If you hadn't guessed, I'm a slightly unorthodox economist in that sense. And I've working through this, I've been very conscious of the fact that, you know, for 2 centuries we got used to the idea, or we were dominated by the idea, that Newtonian mechanics described the universe. It was only when we looked very small that we kind of didn't work anymore and we had to develop quantum mechanics. When we got very big, it didn't work anymore. We needed relativity. And therefore, it's sort of kind of natural, this idea that different theories work at different scales. And I think what's unusual about energy and climate change is precisely that. It forces us to consider how 7 billion individuals really behave with respect to energy and how major, massive, complex, interlinked systems of technology and business evolve. And in terms of the practice, I didn't have time to go into the sort of more specific nitty-gritty of what individual things do governments need to do, but I would say the ultimate key to solving this problem is, you might say, integrating the art and the science. The only kind of art I've ever been good at is music, but so I think in terms of those terms, what's the symphony you can pull with these 3 things working in tandem? And the point is, they can work as a very strongly reinforcing package. And you can just read the words on the left and maybe get some sense of how one can help the other in a reinforcing package. Now, given that, and I think it's already clear now that we will see 21st century systems being radically different from the 20th century. The transition is already underway, albeit in the early stages. It's so far been driven more by the technology-oriented pull policies than by the broader suite, including, I think, appropriate pricing. And that has not been cheap, particularly for Germany, which has led the way. But I think the cost reductions that have been driven by Germany, California, and Chinese production in particular, now mean that the transition is within global reach of every country, and preferably using a more balanced policy packages. And as I said, a clear policy direction can shift risk, it can lower the financing costs, increase the gains to innovation, and thereby also create the potential for an unprecedented, what I think should ideally be public-private coalitions on decarbonisation. And that's basically the ground I wanted to cover. I hope you'll forgive me for finishing with the advert of the book. There are copies available at author's discount if you want to let me know. There's about 500 pages if it's inspired you, but I suspect we'll just want a couple of questions. Thank you.
Cool. This was a very thought-provoking presentation. So I will open the floor to questions.
Thank you very much for your lecture. It was very, very interesting. I would like to make 2 questions. The first one is that although your 3-domain distinction is very, very useful and the analogy with physics works a lot, I think that the quote about Seneca and the 3 domains don't dialogue too much, in the sense that these 3 domains let us define where we want to go. And the question is, where do we want to go? And in that sense, what is the relationship between capitalism and climate change mitigation, and what kind of economic system as a society we would like to walk to? And the second question is about the role of universities, particularly UCL, for example, to tackle this issue. And I wanted to know your opinion about, for example, whether it would be better for UCL to, instead of invest more than £12 million in coal and oil industry, it should invest in renewables. Thank you.
Would you like to answer directly, or should I take a number of questions?
Maybe just briefly on that. In the broad sense, where do we want to go in terms of output is implicit in that slide I did on risk conceptions. We want to remain safe. We therefore need to follow the scientific guidance on what does safe mean, and I think it's a reasonable interpretation that's somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees, and we are not on track at the moment. We need to make much more effort to get on track. And it's a strategic goal which aligns with that third domain of implementation. So things like offshore wind energy in the UK actually are a strategic resource that clearly we need to tap to deliver that objective. You don't need to get bound up in economic arguments about discount rates, etc. We need to develop the industries to tap that. Whether capitalism is a problem, that's a kind of bigger discussion. I actually think pricing is very important. I think economists did huge damage by claiming it was the only thing that mattered. But I think we're almost at risk now of the opposite. I think there is an absolutely central role to harnessing markets and pricing as part of this transition. But I'm sure we may disagree and we may have a much longer conversation. UCL's investment choices, well, I'm actually now running a master's module on planetary economics. And we asked the students to get in groups and debate one question each week. And one of the most entertaining and interesting ones was the question, very simple, divest or engage? And there were lots of different answers, and they're all plausible.
Thanks very much. Just on your pillar 2, I was just wondering if you had any views on the kind of practicalities and effectiveness of the types of offsetting schemes where kind of factories in America, for example, instead decide to clean up factories in China as a cheaper, getting more carbon saved per dollar spent, for example, and whether that actually works in practice.
Probably depends on quite a lot of details. There's a lot of devil in the details. And also, what was your question? Because if the question was, how can I deliver emission reductions in the next few years as cheaply as possible, there's a fair chance that may be somewhere on the other side of the planet. And you might even do quite a bit of good in terms of, cleaner technologies there and helping to build up industries there. On the other hand, if the challenge is a transformational one, and you say, oh, good, I can get dirt cheap emission reductions there, and nobody's really scrutinizing it terribly well, whether it's actually additional, and that will save me from having to do anything difficult, it will achieve the reverse. And I think there's evidence of both. There was a huge history around the clean development mechanism in the Kyoto Protocol, which offered precisely that. It was pretty fundamental to the US agreeing to it. And my verdict on that was, well, the old Chinese saying, be careful what you ask for, because you may get it. It asked for emission reductions as cheap as possible, and they turned out to be absolutely dirt cheap. And you could argue, was that actually adequate?
Hi. You started off by talking about the fact that kind of no one actually owns the commons. In other words, no one has overarching responsibility for global resources. If that's the case, how do you see us? What's the impetus behind us getting to a place where we're not going to go over the temperature limits in 13 years? What's going to be the urgency and the driving factor in making all this change happen?
The classical construction is you have to have a global burden sharing deal. You have to have a global agreement that says, well, you have to incur this much cost to cut your emissions by this much, share out emission targets, so forth. And again, had to skate over this, but I think there's a lot of both empirical evidence and rationales why that just failed, didn't work very well. And the reason why I've gone down this track is saying, you know what, that's not necessary. You don't need a global burden sharing deal, because this is not a game of burdens. This is a game of investment and returns and transformation. And you probably need a critical mass, but that critical mass, once formed, can drive a transformation in the way that we have seen at certain points in history of major industrial transformation that then spread out. And usually the originators of that do extremely well, which is why I finished on that note about you can create coalitions which will solve this problem. And if some governments want to desperately try and cling on to last century's energy systems, name no names, that will end up their problem. It's unfortunate, they will emit more in the meantime, but they will not benefit from it. I think the transformation is starting to happen faster than I expected at the technological level. I think the world is still waiting to see and working out how to respond to President Trump.
And on that note, I think, unfortunately,
Damn, I tried to avoid that for the whole...
Thank you very, very much for the really thought-provoking lecture today. And, again, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.